The winter of 1983 settled over Maryland with the kind of slow, heavy cold that seemed to dim the colors of the world. In the early mornings, the streets of Montgomery County felt suspended in a muted silence, broken only by the distant hum of a passing car or the soft crackle of a radio tuned to an AM station. It was a period marked by shifting hospital protocols, long night shifts, and a growing unease among medical staff who worked through the lingering anxieties of the late 1970s. Nurses walked to their cars with their keys held between their fingers, a habit encouraged during safety briefings, though no one could point to a recent event that justified the fear. Yet something was changing just beneath the surface, something that would not fully reveal itself until patterns began to line up with uncomfortable precision. The first case that would later be linked to the Maryland serial killer was not recognized as such in the moment. Their nurse, whose name was later altered in the report, Linda, name altered, was found seated in her own car after finishing a double shift at a community hospital near Germantown. Her head rested against the window as though she had simply fallen asleep from exhaustion, something that was far from uncommon in an era where staffing shortages were routine. A disposable syringe lay gently in her open hand, the plastic barrel catching the faint orange glow of the parking lot lamp. At the time, investigators labeled it a tragic medical accident, a private miscalculation by an overworked professional who had spent years caring for others while neglecting herself. The hospital administrator made a brief statement. The newspapers reported it without sensationalism, and life continued, or seemed to. Maryland in the early 1980s was a place of quiet neighborhoods and long commutes, where the hum of old sedans traveling Route 355 blended with the soft static of radios playing late-night blues. People locked their doors at night, but many still left their porch lights on as a gesture of familiarity rather than fear. Yet the unease within the nursing community grew subtly, almost imperceptibly, as months passed. A second case emerged in 1984, this time in Silver Spring. Another nurse, also found sitting upright inside her vehicle after an overnight shift, with a syringe placed in her hand as if arranged with deliberate care. The police noted the similarity, but dismissed it as coincidence. They labeled it another exhaustion-related tragedy, unrelated to anything larger. No fingerprints of value, no signs of struggle, no witnesses, and no immediate indications of criminal behavior. They had little to hold on to. Throughout 1985 and 1986, Maryland's hospitals continued to operate under relentless pressure. Nurses were often praised publicly as the backbone of the healthcare system, but privately expected to endure long shifts with minimal emotional support. The stress, the fatigue, and the revolving door of responsibilities created an atmosphere where tragedies could be easily explained away as byproducts of the profession. But not everyone felt comfortable with the pattern. Some nurses began walking in groups to the parking lots, others requested escorts, and a few changed their schedules to avoid the darkest hours of the morning. They spoke of a silent presence lingering near the employee parking areas, an old van occasionally spotted idling in the distance, a figure who never seemed to walk toward the hospital but remained inside the vehicle with the engine running. No license plate number was ever recorded. The van was always described differently, sometimes blue, other times gray, but always old enough that the paint had begun to fade under decades of sun and rain. By 1987, internal memos circulated quietly among hospital administrators, warning staff to remain aware of their surroundings after dark. The memos avoided alarming language, opting instead for clinical phrases like heightened vigilance recommended and report unusual activity to security. The warnings were forgotten as quickly as they were read, until the third officially documented case appeared. A nurse from a facility outside Rockville failed to arrive home after her shift. Her car was found the next morning in the farthest corner of the hospital parking lot, positioned neatly as though she had parked it herself. She was seated inside, hands resting peacefully in her lap. Again, the syringe lay gently in her right hand. This time, however, the medical examiner raised quiet concerns. The drug found in her system was not commonly used by nurses on shift, nor was it easily accessible without specific authorization. That detail, though noted, was not enough to trigger a full criminal investigation. Still, something in the air shifted. Rumors circulated in hospital break rooms and cafeterias. Nurses whispered about a man who appeared to watch them from a distance. Some claimed he drove an old van, different colors depending on the storyteller. but always described as the kind that belonged to someone who preferred not to be noticed. Others recalled seeing a figure pacing near the tree line, partially hidden by shadow, observing with an unsettling stillness. None of these details were ever officially confirmed, but they became part of the collective unease that grew year after year. Meanwhile, Maryland's law enforcement agencies were preoccupied with a wave of unrelated crimes across the state. The late 1980s brought challenges that stretched resources thin: drug trafficking on certain corridors, economic shifts in Baltimore and surrounding regions, and rising concerns about public safety in suburban neighborhoods adjusting to rapid expansion. In this environment, patterns involving nurses in quiet hospital parking lots were not immediately recognized as part of something larger. After all, the victims showed no obvious signs of struggle, no evidence of scenes disturbed by violence, and no witnesses who could confidently describe anything unusual. The turning point began quietly in the autumn of 1989, when a young reporter for a local newspaper in Bethesda started looking into the deaths. She noticed the subtle consistencies across the cases: profession, location, time of disappearance, the placement of the syringe. She contacted hospitals for statements, but most administrators dismissed her inquiries. Still, she continued her research, digging through old police logs, collecting dates and mapping locations on a large sheet of paper taped above her desk. What began as curiosity evolved into a growing suspicion that the deaths were not isolated tragedies, but connected incidents forming a slow, deliberate pattern. By early 1990, she reached out to a detective in Montgomery County who had previously flagged one of the cases as unusual but inconclusive. Her questions reignited his interest. He began reviewing past reports, noting the same unsettling details she had discovered. The detective, known for his quiet persistence, requested access to case files that had long been shelved. He found similarities in the victims' final movements. Each had walked alone to the parking lot after working a late night or early morning shift. Each had been discovered seated inside her own car. Each had a syringe placed gently in her hand. None of the women had shown signs of panic within hours of their disappearance, suggesting they either knew the killer or never sensed the danger approaching. The detective noticed one additional detail recorded inconsistently across the reports: an old van spotted near at least 3 of the hospitals. The descriptions differed just enough to resist a definitive match, but the pattern was unmistakable. The van appeared only in the hours before dawn. It was always described as quiet, rarely moving, its headlights either turned off or dimmed to the point of near invisibility. He began to suspect a ritualistic component, not in the sensational sense, but in the behavioral pattern of someone who found comfort in repetition. The positioning of the body, the object placed in the hand, the predictable selection of victims, and the apparent lack of physical struggle all suggested a mind operating within a controlled internal logic. The killer, whoever he was, did not seek chaos but structure. He approached with calmness, not frenzy. He left his mark not through brutality, but through arrangement. As the 1990s progressed, the tension grew. Nurses spoke more openly about their fears. Security patrols increased. Some hospitals installed additional lights in their parking lots, though many of the new bulbs flickered under the weight of winter or dimmed with age. Journalists began to ask harder questions, connecting the dots in a way the public could no longer ignore. Still, without firm evidence, the authorities hesitated to declare the existence of a serial killer. They referred to the incidents as unresolved anomalies and emphasized the importance of avoiding public panic. By the winter of 1991, the pattern had grown too persistent to ignore. Maryland's hospitals, already worn by years of understaffing and exhausted personnel, found themselves confronting a fear that no administrative bulletin could soothe. Nurses began requesting escorts to their cars at night, not because of a specific event, but because the silence in the parking lots had taken on a new weight. Conversations in break rooms shifted from patient loads and scheduling conflicts to uneasy exchanges about shadowy figures, dimly lit vehicles, and a sense of being observed. It was not hysteria. It was something quieter, more rational, the kind of instinct that emerges only after repeated subtle warnings. The detective who had reopened the old files found himself unable to shake the feeling that the killer had never stopped. If anything, the intervals between incidents had narrowed. The victims, all nurses returning to their cars after long shifts, continued to be discovered seated upright, hands resting peacefully with a syringe placed delicately in their grasp. The placement varied slightly, sometimes tilted toward the center console, sometimes angled toward the window, but always arranged with deliberate softness. It was as though the killer wanted the scene to appear calm, controlled, devoid of chaos. The absence of struggle was as chilling as anything else. Throughout 1991 and 1992, the detective met quietly with hospital security teams, administrators, and a handful of medical examiners who agreed that something deeper was unfolding. He learned that several nurses had reported seeing an old grey van parked at the edge of a wooded area near one of the facilities. Others claimed the vehicle was blue or white with peeling paint, but the shape, the era, remained consistent. A model from the late 1970s, boxy, with its headlights dimmed or partially covered. The engine was described as soft, not loud or sputtering, suggesting the killer maintained the vehicle meticulously despite its age. The detective began driving to hospitals late at night, parking near the far end of the lots, watching the comings and goings of exhausted nurses. He noted moments when shadows lingered too long between the cars, when a figure appeared to stand at the edge of the lights without approaching. Occasionally he spotted vans passing through, none of which matched the vague descriptions in the reports. Yet the sense of a presence remained. He wrote in his notes, later marked as details reconstituted, that the air in certain parking lots held a tension that does not belong to coincidence. Meanwhile, local news outlets remained cautiously quiet. They mentioned concerns about late-night incidents involving healthcare workers, but refrained from labeling the situation as serial in nature. Editors feared provoking unnecessary panic, especially since there was no conclusive forensic evidence to tie the cases together. Most of the victims' families had requested privacy, and their grief remained largely unseen by the public. Nurses in mourning returned to their shifts with heavy eyes and practiced composure, their sorrow blending into the rhythm of care that defined their everyday existence. The killer, however, did not waver. In early 1993, another nurse, Martha, name altered, was found seated in her car outside a hospital in Tacoma Park. The syringe was present, placed gently in her hand with the same calculated silence that marked the previous cases. Everything about the scene felt familiar, yet investigators noted a subtle shift. The angle of her body suggested she had turned toward someone standing outside the driver's side window. Her keys were still in the ignition, and the radio played a low AM broadcast of late-night weather reports. Witnesses recalled seeing a van driving slowly near the staff entrance earlier that evening, though none could provide enough detail to identify it. This case pushed the detective to pursue a more formal review. He submitted a request to reopen all related files, linking the incidents through consistent behavioral markers rather than forensic evidence. The request was initially met with hesitation, but the growing number of cases, combined with pressure from a small group of journalists, forced the department to acknowledge the similarities. A task force was formed discreetly, without public announcement, to examine the possibility that a serial killer had been operating in Maryland for nearly a decade. The task force reviewed each case with clinical detachment. They mapped the locations of the hospitals, calculated the distances between them, and analyzed the likely routes taken by nurses at the ends of their shifts. They studied security logs that had gone unread for years, looking for patterns in vehicle movement or unusual activity. In doing so, they discovered a detail that had slipped through the cracks. In at least 4 cases, the victims had reported small, seemingly insignificant incidents days before their deaths. Someone had jiggled their doorknob late at night. A man had asked for directions in a hospital corridor where visitors were rarely seen. A figure had stood near their mailbox in the early morning darkness, but disappeared before anything could be said. None of the details were alarming in isolation. Together, however, they formed a quiet prelude to something far more deliberate. The killer had not chosen his victims randomly. He had studied their routines, observed the rhythm of their shifts, and approached at moments when exhaustion made vigilance fragile. His method relied on subtlety, familiarity, and the illusion of safety. By 1994, whispers about a parking lot presence had spread across multiple counties. Nurses who worked overnight shifts developed small rituals to calm their nerves, holding their breath while crossing the darkest parts of the lot, checking their back seats before entering their cars, keeping small flashlights in their pockets even when the hospital corridors were brightly lit. Some drove home with their radios turned to low-volume static, the sound oddly comforting. Others began noticing the same detail the detective had fixated on, the quiet vans that seemed to appear and disappear without purpose. It was during this period that the task force received a report from a night shift security guard, name altered, working at a hospital in Prince George's County. He described seeing an old van parked beneath a flickering street lamp near the edge of the property. The driver never exited. Instead, he watched nurses leave the building from behind the cracked windshield. The guard approached, but before he could speak, the van drove away with a slow, measured calm, its headlights dimmed almost to darkness. The guard wrote down part of the license plate, but 2 digits were unclear. Still, it was the first tangible lead in years. The detective felt a subtle shift in his understanding of the killer. This was not a man driven by impulse or chaos. He was patient, methodical, and deeply familiar with the rhythms of hospital life. His patterns suggested an internal structure, a ritualistic cadence that brought him back to the same environment again and again. The syringe was not a symbol of violence, it was a controlled signature, left behind with the softness of someone arranging an object that held personal meaning. As the investigation deepened, the task force began reaching out to neighboring states, searching for similar incidents that might expand the pattern. They discovered cases in rural Pennsylvania and Northern Virginia that bore striking similarities. Medical professionals found seated in their vehicles, no signs of disturbance, a small object placed in their hand. These cases were older, dating back to the late 1970s and early 1980s, when record-keeping was inconsistent and many incidents were dismissed as accidents. The possibility that the killer had operated across state lines only increased the urgency. The task force's meetings became more frequent, the discussions more pointed. They analyzed the likely psychological profile of the perpetrator. He was careful, adaptable, emotionally detached and capable of approaching his victims without triggering alarm. Someone who existed in the margins, rarely noticed, seldom questioned, quietly persistent. The van became central to the profile. It was not just a vehicle but an extension of the killer's pattern, providing mobility, concealment, and a sense of control. Meanwhile, nurses continued their work, driven by duty and routine. They cared for patients with the same calm dedication as always, even as the parking lots outside the hospital walls held an unease that grew with each incident. They noticed the way certain shadows seemed longer than they should be, the way headlights moved slowly past rows of cars without stopping, the way the air felt heavier in the hours before dawn. By late 1994, the tension across Maryland had reached a quiet peak. The task force believed they were close to understanding the pattern, but they lacked the final piece. A witness who had seen more than shadows, more than a silhouette behind a windshield. They needed someone who had encountered the killer directly, even if they had not realized it at the time. The witness emerged quietly, almost accidentally, in the early spring of 1995. She was a nurse, Eleanor, name altered, working at a mid-sized hospital in the outskirts of Gaithersburg. Her shift had ended just after 2 in the morning, a time when the hallways stood nearly silent, the buzz of fluorescent lights more noticeable than the presence of people. She walked toward the staff parking lot with her coat draped over her arm, her badge tucked into her pocket, and her mind drifting through routine thoughts about chart updates she needed to finish in the morning. She did not expect anything unusual, only the quiet, the cold, and the faint hum of the vending machines near the exit. When she stepped onto the asphalt, the air felt heavier than usual, as though the night had thickened around the edges. She paused halfway to her car, noticing something she couldn't immediately name. A van sat parked near the far corner of the lot, its engine running softly, headlights off. The exhaust rose in faint rhythmic puffs, barely visible beneath the dimming street lamp. At first she assumed it belonged to an overnight technician, or maybe a janitorial worker. But then she realized she had never seen this van before, not during any of her previous night shifts. The driver's silhouette was faintly visible through the windshield. He sat motionless, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed forward. Something about the stillness unsettled her. She slowed her pace, her footsteps soft against the asphalt. A part of her wanted to turn back, return to the safety of the building. Another part reminded her that she had walked this path countless times without incident. She decided to continue, but angled her steps slightly, giving the van a wider berth than usual. As she approached her own car, A small sedan parked under the reach of a flickering light. She felt the weight of the driver's gaze shift toward her. She did not look directly at him, but she sensed the movement, the subtle change in attention. Her keys trembled slightly in her hand. She unlocked the door quickly, slipped inside, and locked it immediately. Her breath fogged the windshield. For a moment she simply sat there, hands on the steering wheel, trying to steady herself before starting the ignition. The van did not move. Instead, its engine continued to idle with a low, steady hum. She put her car in reverse, checked the mirrors repeatedly, and backed out of the space with more caution than she had ever used before. As she drove toward the exit, she glanced once in her rearview mirror. The van's driver had turned his head to follow her departure. Only his outline was visible, but the shape of it, the stillness, the height of the shoulders, the posture, etched itself into her memory. The encounter lasted less than a minute, but for the task force, it was the first-hand description from someone who had seen the van's driver, while aware of the larger pattern. When Elena reported the incident 3 days later, her voice carried a quiet certainty that something was deeply wrong. Her statement described a man of average build, sitting with an unusual stiffness, as though he were more focused on maintaining composure than comfort. His silhouette suggested he wore a heavy coat or jacket. She could not describe his face, but she remembered the way he seemed to wait, not simply idling but watching. The task force treated her account with gravity. For months they had sifted through fragmented clues, vehicle descriptions, and faded reports. Now, for the first time, they had a living witness who felt strongly that she had encountered the person behind the pattern. They expanded patrols around the hospital parking lots, placed plainclothes officers in unmarked vehicles near the areas nurses most frequently passed through, and installed additional lighting in several facilities. Some hospitals even coordinated temporary shuttle escorts for night shift staff, though many nurses were reluctant to use them for fear of being perceived as overly anxious. Even as the task force increased its efforts, the killer remained elusive. His method was built on subtlety, on approaching his victims with calm familiarity, on blending into the quiet rhythms of the night. He did not rely on force, nor did he leave behind visible chaos. Instead, he used routine as a disguise, slipping into the spaces between exhaustion and vulnerability, targeting those who spent their lives caring for others. By the end of 1995, the task force compiled an internal dossier narrowing the killer's potential background. They noted that he displayed knowledge of hospital layouts, staff schedules, and employee habits. He understood how nurses exited the buildings, where they parked, and when the lots stood sparsest. His familiarity with medical supplies, specifically the syringes he placed in their hands, suggested he had either worked in or spent significant time around medical environments. Perhaps he had once been a technician, an orderly, or even a maintenance worker, someone who could walk through the corridors without drawing attention. The profile emphasized emotional detachment. The killer seemed composed, patient, observant. He did not appear motivated by anger or chaos, but by a ritualistic psychological pattern, something internal, steady, and predictable. His victims were not chosen randomly. They were selected based on a combination of routine and accessibility. Nurses represented something stable, dependable, and vulnerable in their exhaustion. To him, they were part of a pattern he controlled. In early 1996, the task force received another call. A nurse had been found in her car outside a hospital near Laurel. She was discovered seated upright, her posture calm, her eyes half closed as though drifting into sleep. The syringe lay in her hand, angled toward the center console. The medical examiner again found no signs of struggle. The drug in her system matched one used occasionally in hospital settings, but required authorization to access. The familiarity of the scene struck the investigators with an unsettling clarity. The killer had grown practiced, almost refined in the execution of his ritual. But this case offered something new. A maintenance worker reported seeing a van of similar description parked behind the hospital's service area several nights earlier. He had noticed a man sitting inside, his posture rigid, his face obscured by darkness. He had assumed the man was an employee taking a break. But now, with news of the victim, the memory felt significant. The task force cross-referenced logs from all hospitals within a 30-mile radius. They identified multiple reports of suspicious vans appearing in the early morning hours, always parked just far enough away to avoid direct scrutiny. They noted that the van often left without headlights fully engaged, slipping into the shadows of the empty streets. The detective, who had been following the case for years, found himself increasingly consumed by its details. He filled notebook after notebook with maps, dates, witness accounts, and behavioral analyses. He spent hours sitting in hospital parking lots, watching the flow of vehicles, the patterns of staff movement, the way shadows pooled near the edges of the property. He noticed how nurses often hurried across the darkest stretches, how they clutched their bags a little tighter, how they looked over their shoulders even when no one seemed to be there. One night, while monitoring a lot near a hospital in Wheaton, he caught sight of a van that fit the general description. It drove slowly past the staff entrance and turned into a dimly lit side lane. He followed at a discreet distance, keeping his headlights low. The van moved with practiced calm, its speed steady, never accelerating or braking sharply. It turned onto a residential road and eventually disappeared into a cluster of older homes. The detective wrote down the time, the direction, and the partial plate number he could see, though 2 digits were obscured by grime or damage. This partial number matched the digits provided by the security guard months earlier. It was the first concrete connection between sightings. The task force deepened its investigation. They analyzed vehicle registrations associated with vans from the late 1970s and early 1980s that matched the descriptions. They cross-referenced the results with individuals who had worked in or near medical facilities over the past 15 years. The list narrowed, but not enough to identify a single suspect. Still, progress felt close, just beyond reach, as though concealed by one more layer of shadow. Meanwhile, nurses continued living through the pattern without fully knowing how close the danger lingered. Some changed their routines entirely, parking nearer to the main entrance, requesting co-workers to walk with them, leaving the building in small groups. Others remained unaware of the full extent of the investigation, knowing only through rumor that someone was watching the night shifts more closely. In late 1996, a new detail shifted the trajectory of the case. A nurse from a hospital in Frederick reported that for several weeks she had noticed the same van following her for short stretches after her shifts. It never approached too closely, but it appeared often enough that she felt a growing sense of unease. She described the driver as unremarkable in appearance, someone who could slip easily into anonymity. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, never reacting to traffic, never breaking the steady line of motion that defined his presence. This repeated sighting gave the task force something stronger than speculation. It provided a consistent behavioral pattern tied to a specific vehicle. They increased surveillance across multiple counties, coordinating with local police departments to watch for vans matching the description. Officers were instructed to note any vehicle that drove slowly near hospital staff entrances during late-night hours, especially those that appeared more than once. By early 1997, the pattern began tightening. The killer's movements, once diffuse and unpredictable, started to reveal a geographical rhythm. The task force developed a map showing the most probable routes he traveled, based on reported sightings, incident locations, and time intervals between attacks. The routes highlighted a central area, a region the killer seemed to orbit repeatedly. The detectives believed that if they watched closely enough, long enough, the van would reappear. And eventually it did. The van reappeared in the late summer of 1997, at first as a flicker of possibility rather than a confirmed sighting. A nurse leaving a hospital in Bowie noticed a familiar silhouette idling near the edge of the employee parking lot. She did not understand why the shape unsettled her until later, when she recalled news circulating quietly among hospital staff about a vehicle that matched the description. The van sat in the same half-lit position witnesses had described for years, a vantage point that allowed the driver to observe without being fully seen. Its headlights were dimmed to a warm amber glow, barely piercing the darkness. When the nurse walked toward her own car, she felt that quiet, unspoken sensation that marks the line between coincidence and deliberate presence. She reported the sighting to security, who notified local law enforcement. By the time officers arrived, the van had already disappeared into the night, but the report triggered renewed urgency. The task force, now operating with a heightened sense of coordination, broadened their surveillance radius. They instructed hospitals across multiple counties to immediately report any suspicious vehicle sightings, no matter how minor or uncertain. Around this time, the detective who had followed the case from its early threads began to notice a shift in the killer's pattern. The incidents had once been spaced months apart, with long, quiet intervals that made each case feel isolated, but now the sightings seemed to occur in shorter rhythms. The killer was circling closer to his familiar territory, perhaps sensing that the world around him was slowly catching up. The detective felt that the killer's internal structure, whatever psychological cadence guided him, was tightening. In September 1997, a tip came from a gas station attendant near College Park. He reported seeing an old van parked at the far end of the lot, the driver inside staring at the hospital across the street. The attendant thought little of it at first. Customers often stopped to rest late at night. But the man's stillness, the way he sat without moving, without adjusting his position, without glancing at the station or nearby traffic, struck him as unnatural. When he later heard about the pattern of nurses found in their cars, he contacted the authorities. The attendant's description added clarity to the profile. The driver was in his late 30s or early 40s, average height, with thinning hair and a face that blended into the kind of anonymity found in countless crowds. Nothing about his appearance was remarkable. That was in itself a crucial detail. The killer had crafted a presence built on invisibility. He did not rely on disguise, he relied on ordinariness. The task force began cross-referencing the attendant's description with employment histories from local medical facilities. They examined the records of former technicians, custodial workers, orderlies, security guards, and part-time employees who had left their positions abruptly or without explanation. The list shrank significantly. A few names clustered within a specific radius, individuals who had worked near the hospitals where the earlier incidents occurred. Among these names, one stood out. He was a former maintenance assistant who had worked at multiple hospitals during the late 1970s and early 1980s. His employment record showed a pattern of short terms, quiet departures, and vague notations about interpersonal difficulties. There was no mention of criminal behavior, only a comment noting that he preferred working alone and avoided unnecessary interaction. His address, recently updated in state records, placed him within a few miles of the central area, highlighted on the task force's map. The detective felt a tightening in his chest. Not excitement, but recognition. The pattern, for the first time, seemed to point toward a real person. Meanwhile, the killer continued his silent survey of the region. Witnesses reported seeing the van near multiple hospitals in late 1997. Each sighting showed the same behavior. The driver remained inside, watching with an unnerving composure. He appeared at odd hours, often between 2 and 4 in the morning, hours when fatigue softened vigilance and when the boundary between safety and vulnerability grew thin. Then, in November of that year, the pattern broke its quiet rhythm. A nurse at a hospital in Annapolis, Julia, name altered, was reported missing after failing to return home from her shift. When officers found her vehicle in the staff parking lot, they recognized the familiar scene. She was seated upright, hands relaxed, her head tilted slightly to the side. The syringe lay in her hand, placed with the same delicate arrangement seen in earlier cases. But this time something was different. The parking lot camera, recently installed and still functioning inconsistently, had captured a faint outline of a vehicle leaving the lot minutes after the nurse's shift ended. The footage was grainy, distorted by the low light and the aging lens. Still, the silhouette of the van was unmistakable. The shape matched the descriptions gathered over more than a decade. Its taillights flickered in a way consistent with older wiring. The plate, though impossible to read, matched the spacing of the numbers that witnesses had provided. The task force knew this was their turning point. They enhanced the footage, clarified the frame edges, and compared the vehicle's proportions to their suspect list. The match was not definitive, but it narrowed possibilities to a single individual, the former maintenance assistant who now lived alone in a small rental property in Prince George's County. His name was marked as name altered in internal documents, pending confirmation. They began surveillance of his residence, observing his routines with clinical attention. He drove an old van, its paint peeling in several places, its engine audible from a distance in a low, steady hum. He rarely interacted with neighbors, carried out his trash at irregular hours, and frequently took late-night drives that led him past hospital parking lots and medical centers. The detective followed him one night, maintaining a careful distance. The van moved through familiar corridors, roads that connected multiple hospitals across Montgomery and Prince George's County. The driver did not stop at any of them. Instead, he looped through the lots, moving slowly, observing the lights, the shifts, the nurses exiting the buildings. His route formed a map of familiarity, as though each location held a quiet significance. The task force debated whether they had enough evidence to intervene. Behavioral patterns alone could not justify an arrest. They needed a direct connection, a witness, an item, a trace of forensic evidence that tied him definitively to the victims. Yet they worried that waiting too long might allow another incident to occur. In December 1997, that fear nearly materialized. A nurse walking to her car in Bethesda reported hearing footsteps behind her. When she turned, she saw a figure stepping back into the shadows between two parked vehicles. She hurried to her car, locked the doors, and drove away with her breath trembling. She later described the figure as wearing a heavy coat, standing with the same unnatural stillness reported by earlier witnesses. The description was consistent with the suspect. With pressure mounting, the task force intensified their surveillance. They followed the suspect's van nightly, documenting every stop, every pause, every slow pass through a hospital parking lot. The detective felt the weight of years building toward a single, inevitable moment. They found that the suspect's movements were predictable in their unpredictability. He never followed the same exact route twice, but he always returned to the same cluster of hospitals. His patterns resembled a quietly pulsing orbit. In early January 1998, during a cold night when frost clung to windshields and the air felt brittle, the detective watched the van pull into the far corner of a hospital lot. A nurse had just exited the building, walking with her bag slung over her shoulder. The suspect turned off his engine. His silhouette shifted slightly as though preparing to step out. The detective knew the moment had arrived. He signaled the unmarked units nearby, and as the van door began to open, the officers moved in. The officers advanced with a precision born from months of preparation, their movements measured, silent, and deliberate. The nurse had not yet noticed the danger behind her, and the suspect had only managed to open the van door halfway before the units converged. The detective approached from the driver's side, his voice calm but firm, as he ordered the man to remain inside the vehicle. For a moment, the suspect did not react. He remained utterly still, his hand resting on the partially opened door, his posture as rigid as it had been described countless times by witnesses. Then, with a slow, almost reluctant motion, he looked up. His eyes were not wild or panicked. They were blank, steady, and chilling in their lack of surprise. He did not speak, nor did he attempt to flee. Instead, he simply watched as the officers encircled the van, their flashlights cutting through the dark interior. The detective reached for the handle and pulled the door fully open. The man stepped out with a quiet compliance that unnerved everyone present. It was as though he had expected this moment to arrive, as though the end of his pattern had always been inevitable. The officers detained him on the spot. The nurse, now aware of the unfolding scene, hurried into the arms of a security guard, shaken but unharmed. The van, still idling softly, emitted the same steady hum that had been noted in several reports over the years. Its interior was revealed slowly, methodically, under the harsh beam of police lights. Inside, the investigators found a collection of items that were not illegal on their own, but became deeply disturbing within the context of the case. Neatly organized on a metal tray were disposable syringes, unused but identical to those found in the victim's hands. A small cooler sat positioned behind the driver's seat, its contents cold but empty. There were hospital ID badges, none of which belonged to the suspect, and a worn notebook filled with dates, cryptic notations, and hospital abbreviations. Each entry corresponded to a shift schedule or a nurse's name, names that appeared throughout years of reports and internal investigations. The detectives were careful not to draw quick conclusions. They catalogued every item, photographed every angle of the van, and ensured the suspect's rights were preserved throughout the process. The task force had spent years avoiding sensational assumptions. Their approach now was clinical, grounded in procedure. They transported the suspect to the station, where he continued his pattern of silent compliance. He answered no questions, requested no attorney, and displayed no outward emotion. His demeanor remained disturbingly consistent, calm, detached, and quietly observant. The interrogation room felt colder than usual. Officers and detectives rotated through, attempting different strategies to elicit a response. None succeeded. The suspect stared at the table, the wall, or the floor, never acknowledging the accusations brought before him. His silence was not defiant. It was hollow, an absence of reaction that hinted at a psychological structure built on introversion and internalized control. The task force consulted psychologists who suggested that his behavior aligned with patterns seen in individuals who operate through ritualized repetition rather than impulsivity. As the investigation continued, forensic teams combed through the van and the suspect's residence. His home was sparsely furnished, almost barren. There were no family photographs, no personal decorations, no signs of guests or meaningful social contact. The refrigerator contained only basic items, all arranged with meticulous neatness. In a small drawer beside his bed, investigators found more hospital schedules, folded precisely, along with a set of keys that matched several of the badges found in the van. The breakthrough came with the discovery of trace residues inside one of the syringes left in his vehicle. Though unused, the syringe contained microscopic remnants matching the substance found in several victims. This connection, combined with the detailed records he had kept, provided the evidence needed to formally charge him. Additional forensic comparisons linked the tires of his van to impressions found near 2 of the hospital lots from earlier cases, strengthening the circumstantial evidence. In the days following his arrest, the news spread through Maryland's medical community with a mixture of relief and grief. Hospitals released brief, carefully worded statements, acknowledging the years of uncertainty and the quiet fear many staff members had carried. Nurses gathered in break rooms, discussing their near encounters, the rumors that had circulated, and the sense of safety that had slowly eroded over the years. Some cried openly, others sat in silence, processing the fact that the pattern had finally been broken. Families of the victims were contacted discreetly. Some had long accepted the official explanations given at the time of their loved ones' deaths. Others had harbored doubts for years. The realization that their losses had been part of a deliberate sequence of crimes brought a mix of sorrow and validation. Reporters attempted to reach them for comment, but most declined, preferring to grieve privately. The formal trial began in early autumn of 1998. The courtroom filled with subdued tension. Prosecutors presented the evidence with clarity, avoiding dramatization. They emphasized the behavioral patterns, the consistent scenes left behind, the matching syringes, and the suspect's detailed records of nurses' schedules. Multiple witnesses testified about seeing the van near hospitals hours before victims were found. Their accounts aligned with precision, forming an unmistakable narrative. The suspect sat through the proceedings with the same blank composure he had displayed since his arrest. He offered no testimony, made no statement, and showed no visible reaction to the charges laid before him. The defense attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the syringes could have been planted, and that the van sightings were coincidences. But the accumulation of patterns, spanning over a decade, left little room for doubt. One of the most powerful testimonies came from the nurse who had encountered the suspect in the parking lot, the same woman whose report had reignited the investigation. She described the silent presence of the van, the way the driver's gaze seemed to follow her, and the feeling that the night itself had changed shape around her. Her account, though devoid of sensational details, held a quiet weight that resonated throughout the courtroom. The prosecution's closing argument focused not on fear but on structure. They portrayed the killings as part of a calculated behavioral pattern, driven by repetition and familiarity rather than passion or chaos. They detailed how the suspect had blended into medical environments, observing schedules and routines, and how he had approached his victims during moments of exhaustion when their vigilance was weakest. They emphasized the absence of struggle, the calm arrangement of the scenes, and the symbolic placement of the syringe, details that revealed the killer's internal structure more clearly than any confession ever could. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Their decision was unanimous. The suspect was found guilty on multiple counts tied to the deaths of the nurses, with additional charges pending investigation across state lines. Given the era and the jurisdiction, the sentence matched the weight of his crimes. He was condemned to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Though the state still maintained capital punishment at the time, the prosecution chose the sentence that guaranteed permanent confinement, citing the need for closure rather than retribution. The sentencing hearing took place in a quiet courtroom with minimal public presence. The detective who had followed the case for more than a decade attended, sitting near the back. He observed the suspect as the sentence was read, The man did not flinch, did not blink rapidly, did not lower his head. He remained as he had always been, still, detached and impenetrable. When the proceedings concluded, the suspect was escorted from the courtroom. As he passed the detective, their eyes met briefly. There was no recognition in the suspect's gaze, no anger, no fear, no remorse, only a vast, unsettling emptiness, as though the internal mechanism that had driven his pattern had simply ceased to function, now that his van, his routines, and his quiet orbit through Maryland's hospital lots had been taken from him. In the weeks that followed, Maryland's hospitals began to exhale a collective breath that had been held for years. Nurses no longer walked to their cars with the same tension in their steps. The van sightings ceased entirely. Parking lots that had once carried a shadow of dread regained their ordinary stillness. Administrators reviewed safety protocols, and new lights were installed in areas that had remained dim for too long. Yet even with the killer behind bars, the damage lingered in subtle ways. Some nurses still found themselves glancing over their shoulders out of habit. Others parked closer to the building entrances, unwilling to return to the darkest corners of the lot. A few transferred to day shifts or moved out of state entirely. Trauma of this nature does not dissolve with a single arrest. It lingers in the quiet spaces where fear once rooted itself. The detective retired from the force a year later, though not because the case had drained him, rather because he felt his work had come to its natural conclusion. The files that had once filled his desk now sat closed, archived in boxes labeled "Resolved." He carried with him not pride, but a sober recognition of the fragility that had defined the years-long pursuit. Still, one part remained: the reflection, the quiet acknowledgement that patterns, once formed, can shape not only the perpetrator, but the world around them. In the months after the trial concluded, the rhythm of hospital life in Maryland slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The nurses resumed their routines, though with a lingering caution that would take years to fade. Parking lots once marked by unease became simply parking lots again. Quiet spaces filled with the soft clatter of car doors opening, the rustle of coats, and the muted conversations of colleagues walking together toward their shifts. Administrators introduced improved lighting, expanded security patrols, and encouraged staff to leave the building in pairs during the early morning hours. These precautions were subtle acknowledgments of a fear that had shaped the region for more than a decade. The van, once a familiar silhouette drifting through the darkest corners of multiple counties, was stored as evidence in a secured facility. Its presence behind locked doors felt symbolic, an artifact of a pattern that had finally been halted. Investigators occasionally returned to examine it, searching for additional forensic traces that might connect the suspect to cases in neighboring states. But the van remained silent, its interior emptied, its engine cold. Whatever purpose it had served within the killer's internal logic had ended the night he was taken into custody. The suspect himself adjusted to life within the structured environment of the prison system. His days became monotonous cycles, meal times, counts, cell rotations, none of which elicited visible reaction. He interacted minimally with other inmates, avoided disciplinary issues, and spent long stretches staring at the floor or the wall, as if the blank surfaces offered continuity with the quiet spaces where he had once observed nurses leaving their shifts. Psychological evaluations concluded that he possessed a pattern-oriented mindset, driven less by anger than by repetition and internalized structure. His crimes were not impulsive but ritualistic, born from a private cadence he never articulated. The absence of confession became part of his profile, not a sign of defiance, but an extension of the emptiness that had defined his behavior. As weeks turned into months, investigators across state lines contacted Maryland's task force. They brought with them unresolved cases involving medical professionals discovered under similar circumstances, subtle scenes, no struggle, a sense of calm imposed upon the victim. Some of these cases dated back to the late 1970s, aligning with the earliest years the suspect had worked in medical facilities. Though not all could be conclusively tied to him, the behavioral consistencies were striking. The quiet presence near hospital grounds, the methodical observation of routines, and the placement of a small object in the victim's hand were all elements of a pattern that had gone unnoticed for decades. The detective who had dedicated much of his career to the case continued to consult on these investigations. Though retired, he offered insight about the suspect's habits, the van's importance within the pattern, and the subtle signals that had accompanied each escalation. He spoke rarely about the emotional toll of the case, but colleagues noted that he carried himself with a somber composure, neither triumphant nor burdened, simply aware of the delicate line between vigilance and complacency. During one consultation, he was asked why he believed the killer had chosen nurses so consistently. He paused before answering, his voice quiet but certain. Nurses, he explained, often walked alone at the end of long shifts, exhausted yet composed. They operated within structured environments, their routines predictable. In many ways, they embodied the order the suspect seemed to seek. Their calmness, dedication, and the quiet resilience required of their profession made them symbols of stability. Stability the killer sought to replicate in his own controlled ritual. It was not personal, it was patterned. Meanwhile, the families of the victims continued to heal in their own private ways. Some found comfort in the arrest and conviction, while others struggled with the realization that the deaths once attributed to exhaustion or workplace stress were deliberate acts. Support groups formed quietly, bringing together those affected by the pattern. Participants shared memories not defined by tragedy, but by the everyday moments they cherished, small reminders that their loved ones had existed beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Hospitals across Maryland established annual remembrance days honoring the victims. These were not public ceremonies, they were quiet gatherings held in chapels, conference rooms, or small outdoor gardens. Nurses lit candles, shared reflections, and supported one another. The events reinforced the sense of community that had been shaken but not broken by years of uncertainty. Each name read aloud carried weight, grounding the abstract notion of a pattern in the lived experiences of individuals who had cared for others with unwavering dedication. The task force disbanded formally in the summer following the conviction, though its members maintained professional connections. They compiled a final comprehensive report detailing the investigation from its earliest identified threads to the suspect's arrest. The report emphasized the importance of recognizing behavioral patterns, especially those that develop quietly over long periods. It also highlighted the need for improved communication between hospitals, law enforcement agencies, and medical staff, a lesson drawn not from sensational fear, but from the slow accumulation of subtle indicators that had, for too long, been dismissed as coincidence. The detective read the report's final draft in his home, where the evening light filtered through the curtains with the same muted glow he had observed countless times while sitting in hospital parking lots during the investigation. As he turned the pages, he noticed something that had remained consistent throughout his career. Patterns often reveal themselves not through dramatic events, but through quiet consistencies. An old van that returns too often, a series of scenes arranged with unnatural calm, a repetition of small details that form the outline of something larger. He closed the report with a sense of closure, not for himself, but for the community that had lived through the uncertainty. The killer was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again step into the silent hours outside a hospital. His pattern had been disrupted permanently, contained within the rigid structure of the correctional system. In a sense, the sentence had placed him in an environment that reflected the internal rigidity he had imposed on others, a place defined by routine without purpose, repetition without autonomy. In the years that followed, Maryland continued to grow and change. New hospitals were built, old ones renovated, and the culture of safety evolved with them. Nurses entering the profession in the early 2000s heard fragments of the story, warnings offered during orientation, reminders to walk with colleagues at night, an emphasis on being aware of one's surroundings. Many did not know the full history behind these guidelines, only that they were rooted in real events, in a pattern that had once cast a long shadow over the region. Yet there were some who remembered everything. They remembered the unease that settled into the parking lots, the whispered conversations in break rooms, and the quiet dread that accompanied night shifts. They remembered the first time they saw brighter lights installed, the relief that followed the arrest, and the realization that the silence outside their workplaces had once held more than empty air. They remembered the van, the stillness, the patterns, and as time moved forward, they allowed themselves to breathe more freely. The detective, now living a quieter life, occasionally drove past hospitals he had once watched for hours at a time. The lots looked different, more secure, more illuminated, but they held echoes of the past. When he saw nurses crossing the asphalt with steady steps and relaxed shoulders, he recognized that the community had reclaimed spaces once defined by fear. He also knew that vigilance was not about expecting danger at every turn. It was about understanding how quickly patterns can form in silence and how important it is to notice the small details that accumulate at the edges of ordinary life. On a cold evening near the end of the decade, he parked his car across from one of the hospitals central to the investigation. The wind carried the faint hum of distant traffic, and the glow of street lamps cast elongated shadows across the ground. He watched as a group of nurses walked toward their cars, laughing softly, their conversations blending into the gentle rhythm of the night. Their presence marked a quiet triumph, not of law enforcement over a criminal, but of a community restoring its own sense of safety. The detective remained in his car for a while, reflecting on the fragile balance between order and chaos. The case had taught him that danger often moves quietly, that it hides not in dramatic acts but in subtle consistencies. It taught him that the human mind, both in its resilience and its vulnerabilities, shapes patterns that can define entire eras. And it taught him that understanding those patterns is essential, not to live in fear, but to recognize the profound significance of the ordinary moments that fill each day. When he finally turned the key in the ignition, the engine hummed with a steady warmth. He took one last look at the hospital and then drove away, the road stretching ahead in a long, dark line softened by the glow of headlights. Behind him, the parking lot remained calm, still illuminated, and free from the silent presence that had once haunted it for so many years. And in that calm, the final truth settled. Patterns break, but the memory of them endures, not to frighten but to remind that silence can hold danger but also healing, that shadows can conceal harm but also pass with time, that even the quietest patterns can be recognized, confronted, and finally ended. The Maryland serial killer, who once chose nurses and left syringes in their hands, would spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell, his pattern extinguished, his orbit closed. The nurses he once watched now walked freely beneath the hospital lights, reclaiming the spaces he had tried to turn into shadows, and the night, once heavy with unease, became simply night again, still, fragile, human, and filled with the quiet resilience that marks every victory over fear.